Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with an exciting video. I'm gonna go through all of my palettes and I will do a small declutter as well. So I'm gonna insert some footage of all of my palettes, my whole palette collection as of the end of the year. And I'm also, like I said, gonna get rid of a couple, so I'll discuss that throughout the video. But before I jump into the palettes themselves, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So the first palette that we have is my Modern Renaissance palette. This is a classic. I'm not going to open this one up though because it is my Panda palette of the year. But yeah, this one will be gone relatively soon. So I won't be decluttering it now, but it will be gone as soon as I finish this palette, which should hopefully be beginning of next year. Sticking with Anastasia, the next palette is my Soft Glam palette. This one is a beautiful kind of neutral palette. It looks like this. Yeah, I really love this palette. I haven't used it enough this year, but it's mainly because I've been panning my Modern Renaissance palette and it also has a lot of neutral tones in it. But I have reached for every single shade in this palette this year, which I'm happy about. I just wish I would have gotten some more use out of it because it is a beautiful palette for every day. Probably my favorite palette from Anastasia is the Norvina palette. I love this palette. When I first got it, I wasn't too sure about it, but I have really grown to love this palette. Like I said, I think it's just stunning with the kind of top row of shimmers here and then the mattes, and the tones in here are absolutely beautiful as well. I feel like the shimmers in here as well are more kind of sparkly and impactful than some of the other shimmers in the Anastasia palettes. So I do really love this palette, and of course I'm going to hold on to it. Next up for Anastasia, we have the Sultry palette. This is one that I believe has been discontinued, which is a bit of a shame because it is a beautiful cool tone palette. And I feel like cool tone palettes, they are more common now, but they're still not as common as warm tone palette, I would say. But yeah, this is a beautiful one. And again, it's one I haven't reached for as much as I wanted this year. But that's kind of what happens when I pan a neutral palette because I focus so much on that one. But yeah, this is one that I have been reaching for more this kind of season. Is one that I think is beautiful for December, so this one I'm definitely going to try to reach for more in the last couple of days of the year. The next palette from Anastasia is Subculture. This is a bit of a controversial one, but I think a lot of people now love it. But when it first came out, you know the drama with this palette. I personally really like this palette. The only downside I would say to it is that some of the kind of colorful shades look very grey on the eyes. Like Destiny, for example, looks very grey on the eyes. Obviously Mercury is also very grey, and I feel like they're a bit more muted on the eyes than they might look in the pan. I do love the bottom row though. The bottom row is my favorite, especially, you know, Electric is definitely my favorite. I love these two tones as well. But yeah, I do really love this palette, and as you can see, it looks very well loved. I've had this in different projects, which is why I have so many pans on it. Next up we have the Jackie Aina palette. This is a palette that a lot of people think has the best formula from Anastasia. I like this palette, but it's not necessarily my perfect color story, so because of that I don't reach for it that much. I think the ones that I've shown you so far, I've reached for every single shade in every one of those palettes, but this is the first one I haven't reached for every single shade in. I'm just a bit tired of these kind of tones right here, the pinks and the not the pinks maybe, but like the reds and the purples, and like the plummy shades. But yeah, it is a stunning palette. I love Sponsored. That is a beautiful eyeshadow. So is Sam. It's like a very sparkly shade, and it's not very common to have those super sparkly shades in mainstream palettes like that, so I do really appreciate that. Supreme is also a nice pink, but overall it's not a color solid that I would reach for every single day. However, I am really happy to have it in my collection. Next up we have the Prison palette. This is actually the newest Anastasia palette in my collection. I did get this on eBay last year, I believe, and I have gotten some good use out of it. As you can see, I have some pans in it now. It didn't have any pans when I got this palette. It was pre-loved, but it was very lightly used. This palette though is one that I am going to declutter. I do like the color story still, but the formula in here isn't the best, and I just feel like this is a color story that I wouldn't reach for every single day. I would prefer other things, so because of that I am gonna declutter this palette. I might depot, especially this shade here, I really love that one, so I might depot that into my singles if I don't have anything similar, but this palette will go. And then lastly for Anastasia we have the Amrezy palette. This was a gift from my boyfriend a couple years ago, maybe I've had it for 2 years now. This palette looks like this. I think this color story is beautiful. I really love this palette. I have reached for majority of the shades in here. Some of these shades down here I have not reached for because again they are very similar to the ones in my Modern Renaissance palette. But yeah, again, I love this color story. I love the pinks, similarly like the pinks and purples to the Norvina palette, and it's also mixed with some more kind of warm tone neutrals, which are shades that I use quite regularly. So yeah, this is a palette that I really like, and of course I'm going to hold on to it. The next brand we're going to move on to is Colourpop. The first palette I'm going to talk about is the Lilac You A Lot palette. I think this palette is stunning. I don't really have too many purple palettes in my collection anymore, so this is one that I really like. I like the kind of lighter tones in here, and that they aren't super saturated. Like a lot of purple palettes have a lot of these tones, although I do love this shade. It's probably one of my favorite shades in the palette, but I just love that it's mixed with some more softer purples, which is something that I prefer rather than more jewel tone purples. But yeah, this is the first Colourpop palette that I have. Next up is another kind of more neutral toned palette. This is the Going Coconuts palette, another 9pan. I really like this palette again. I like the undertones in here because they are a bit more cool toned, but they're not super cool toned. I always call these kind of sandy tones, and I really like this palette. I think the undertone is quite unique. Again, it's one that I haven't reached for too much this year because of the Panda palette that I'm working on. However, I have reached for every single shade apart from 2. I'm going to try to reach for them because I'm pre-filming this video a bit, so I'm going to try to reach for those 2 shades in the next couple of days just to complete like every single shade in this palette. Next up for the 9pan palette, we have the Aha Honey palette. This is the monochrome yellow palette. I have switched out the pressed glitter in the middle to more of an orangey shade to give a bit more variety to the palette. I really like this palette too. It's one that I wouldn't necessarily think is 100% necessary to have in my collection because I don't reach for these yellows every single day. However, I still like the color story, and if I did kind of decide to deposit this into my singles, I'm not sure if I would actually get rid of any of the shades, which is why I am holding on to it for now. Then the next Colourpop palette is my Mar palette. You might know that this palette is a bit kind of customized. It's not the original Mar palette. It's mainly the Mar and Sol palette combined with a couple of shades thrown in. I'm not going to spend too much time on this palette because it is a customized palette, but I really like this one and it's perfect for summer. Then basically one of my favorite, probably my favorite Colourpop palette in my collection is the Child palette. This one is the Star Wars Mandalorian collaboration. I just love the greens that are in here. I think this is a really nice, somewhat wearable color story, and even though it has a lot of greens in it, I feel like the tones in here are just something that I can reach for every single day, for like more of a neutral look, although they are greens. The shade of Force here is one of my favorites. I love those type of green, kind of greeny gold shades. It also has some more kind of neutral tones, which makes it again a bit more neutral to wear, and yeah, I just love this palette overall. Moving into the bigger Colourpop palettes in my collection, the first one is my Through My Eyes palette. This one is one that I find really underrated. I feel like a lot of people don't speak about this palette, but I think it's absolutely stunning. It's one that I've held on for a long time. The top row here is more kind of warm tones, whereas the bottom rows are more kind of cool toned, jewel toned shades, and I really love this palette. I always see this as quads, so you can look at every quad, and I feel like that gives a really nice color story. And yeah, I just think it's a really well made palette, and the quality is really nice as well. So yeah, it's one of my favorites in my collection, at least from Colourpop. Next up for Colourpop, we have the Sweet Talk palette. This is another one that I really enjoy. I have again switched out the pressed glitters because I like having my pressed glitters in my singles collection rather than in my palettes. But yeah, this is a very monochromatic palette, but I do think it's really nice, especially for like spring summer. It's one that I haven't reached for too much this year. I just didn't get a chance to reach for it, and once I realized I hadn't reached for this palette yet, it was already kind of moving into autumn time, and it's not really the color story I want to reach for that time of the year. So it's one that's going to be on my list to reach for more next year because I do really love this palette, and it's a shame that I didn't give it more love this year. The last two palettes that I have from Colourpop were both Declutter from my friend Martina. The first one is the At Foresight palette. This was the collaboration with Raw Beauty Christie, and I think this is beautiful. It's like a muted kind of rainbow palette, and if I'm being honest, I haven't reached for this palette yet, but I love staring at it and I love having it in my collection. And I think this is going to be one that is going to be perfect to reach for with a lot of my indie shadows because it is majority mattes. It has two shimmers here though, but I would reach for this one mainly for the mattes. Although both of these shades are shades that I love, so I am really happy to have this in my collection. I just need to make some time to reach for this palette because, again, I haven't reached for it yet. And then the last Colourpop palette that I have is the Flutterby palette. I really think this color story is stunning. It's like a cool tone palette again, but this one is leaning more mauve toned. I was really excited to get this into my collection when I received it from Martina, but however since then I have accumulated a couple more mauve tone palettes, and this is just not my favorite out of those. And since mauve tones like this, like really cool tone mauve tones like this, aren't something that I reach for every single day, I have decided to declutter this palette because I have other things that I would rather reach for, so this one will also go. Moving into the next brand, we have Juvia's Place, and the first palette is my Magic Mini palette. I love this palette. I have gotten a lot of love out of this one, as you might be able to tell. I have pan in almost all the shades apart from this shade here and this shade here. This is a palette that I used to rave about. I do still think it's really good. However, again, since discovering a lot of shimmery kind of indie shadows and like special shades, the shimmers in here just don't cut it anymore for me. It might also be the age of the palette, but because of all of that, I have decided to declutter this palette. There might be again a handful of shades that I want to put into my singles collection depending if I have dupes or not. Like I really like Faso, Suba, Nubia, as well as Yara. Those are probably my favorite shades, so if I don't have any dupe for those, I might put those into my singles collection, but otherwise this palette will go. The next palette is one that have taunted me for the last couple of months, and that is the Try palette, again from Juvia's Place. This is my second palette from Juvia's that I still have in my collection, and I do think this color story is stunning. I feel like the shades in here are beautiful. It's a very well made palette. It's a very unique color story, and also the quality is really nice as well. However, I don't reach for this palette very often. It's getting very washed out by the camera because of the background, but I don't reach for these colors very often, and I just don't find myself reaching for this palette, so I have decided to declutter this palette. However, I'm gonna depot and keep a lot of the shades, especially like these two greens. I love those. Same with this one here. I think that's a beautiful kind of brownie green. I love that one too. These two are definitely going to go, same as this one. These two I'm going to compare with other things I have in my collection again. Same with the orange, and you know, I'm going to probably repress these into smaller pans and put into my singles, but the palette itself will be decluttered. So the next brand I'm going to move into is Natasha Denona. This is my oldest Natasha Denona palette, and it is Metropolis palette. I absolutely love this palette. I've had it now, is it 2 years that I've had this palette? I think this is absolutely stunning. I just love this overall. I haven't gotten a fuse out of it, but you don't need much. Like, these shades are so pigmented, and I have definitely given it more love this autumn than previously, and I really again love this palette. I think it's very versatile. I think the quality in here is really nice. I love that you have more shades to play around with compared to some of her other palettes, and yeah, I think this is a perfect palette. I would love for her to come out with more palettes in this format, maybe like a more spring toned one rather than like an autumnal one like this. I would pick that up in a heartbeat. But yeah, this is one of my favorite palettes from her. I think it's beaten by one, which I will show you next. But yeah, this is the Metropolis palette. And the palette in first place for my Eyeshadow palette is of course the gold palette. I love this one. I've had this in my collection for a year now. I got it as a Christmas present last year from my parents, and this is what this palette looks like. It has gotten a decent amount of love, especially in only a year's time. You can see all the dips in the shimmers. I think this palette is so well made. The color story is beautiful. I think it's perfect for every day. You have a lot of warm tones, but also some more cooler tones if you want to reach for those. Maybe not super cool tone, but more kind of neutral tones. You also have some pops of blue, which works really well with the golds. I think again the quality in here is the best quality that I've tried from Natasha Denona, and I think this is really good. I'm unsure if this one is discontinued or not. There was loads of rumors about it. It disappeared from the website and it came back, so I'm not sure what the status is on this one, but if it's still available I would recommend it 100%. I love this palette so much. It is probably one of my favorites in my collection, if not my favorites. Next up we have the Sunrise palette. This is one of her midi palettes, and I like this palette. It's not my favorite and it's not my least favorite. I think it's one that I haven't reached for too much, but I have reached for every single shade this year, which is nice. I think the tones are beautiful. I just love these kind of warm toned orangey yellows. I also love the kind of purpley tones mixed with those warm tones, and I think this is beautiful. I think it's a very unique color story, and although it's not the one that I reach for every single day like the last two I showed you, or would be more kind of everyday palettes, I still love this one and I'm really happy to have it in my collection. My least favorite Natasha Denona palette is the Love palette. It's one that I haven't gotten that much use out of since I got it. This one was one that was haunting me for the longest time and I really wanted it, and I picked it up again secondhand on eBay. I did the same with Sunrise. The other ones are purchase palette or gifts. So yeah, this one I do really like still. I hit a pan on commitment this year in my Pandas eyeshadows. And individually, I think these tones are beautiful, but I just don't reach for this palette very often, like I said. But I'm gonna try to make a note of using this one more next year or incorporate these shades into BYOPs. Then my newest palette from Natasha Denona is the Bronze palette. I got this as a birthday present from my boyfriend. I haven't even taken off the sticker of the mirror. I am in love with this palette. I did say before that Metropolis is my second favorite, but this one might be up there. This one might beat Metropolis because I just love this color story and the looks I've gotten from this palette. Granted, I only had it for about a month, so I need more time to play around with it before putting it up there as my top favorite. I mean, the gold is always going to be my top favorite, but I love this palette and I'm so happy to have it in my collection. Originally, I thought that maybe this was a color story that I didn't need in my collection because I have so many other neutral tones, but the warmth and richness of this palette is just so stunning and unique, and I'm so happy that I got this from him. I put it in my wish list, obviously, but yeah, I love this palette so much, and it's definitely one I'm going to play around with more in the upcoming year. Lastly, for Natasha Denona, we have one of her mini palettes. I only have one, and this is the Mini Retro. I love this palette too. I haven't played around with it again enough, but I love these tones, the kind of like muted, romantic kind of tones. I love how the kind of grey green shades are mixed with the pinks, and again, it's just one that I really enjoy at the times I have used it. I just need to remember to reach for it more. I think because it's so small in my collection, I forget about it a little bit, but it is one that I do still enjoy. Next brand up is Pat McGrath. I do have 3 palettes from her now. It's actually very recent that I have 3. I only had one to start with, which was the Utopian Dream, which is this palette right here. So this is my first Pat McGrath palette. I really love this one. I got this as my birthday present last year from my boyfriend. So I've had this for just over a year now, and it's one that I have reached for more on special occasions, but I have reached for this one a handful of times this year. I do need to get into the mindset of using my special palettes more often. That's kind of why I want to declutter some in this video as well, just to have less palettes to reach for, and so it doesn't overwhelm me so much. But yeah, this is a beautiful one, and I'm really happy that this was my first one because I have really enjoyed it. The next 2 I got at the same time. The first palette we have is the Bronze Seduction. They all look the same on the outside, but this is what this one looks like on the inside. This is more of a neutral kind of palette. It has again these special shades over here, and yeah, I think this one is one that I'm going to reach for more kind of on everyday kind of occasions. Also like more kind of if I want to go to smoky looks. I have again used this whole palette in different looks. I actually used this one for one of my birthday looks, I think, this year when I was going out to see some friends. So yeah, that is the next palette. And then the final one I have from Pat McGrath is, again, looks the same on the outside, and that is the Divine Rose 1 palette. This one is more of a mauve toned kind of cool tone palette. This is one of the palettes that I talked about that I got recently that kind of replaces the Flutterby palette, because I would much rather reach for this palette than that one, and it has very similar tones. But yeah, that is the next palette. I haven't reached for it too much again because I've only had it for about a month and a half, but it is one that I have enjoyed when I have reached for it. The next brand that we're moving into is Huda Beauty. The first palette I got is this one here. I also got this one as well as one of the mini palettes at the same time. Actually, no, that's not true. I did get another mini palette first, which was the Gold Obsessions, but yeah, this is my first big palette from her. I love this palette, although I feel like I don't love this palette as much as everyone else. I feel like a lot of people feel like this is their Holy Grail palette, and it is stunning. I do really like this, but it's not my Holy Grail. I much prefer the other palettes that I have from Huda Beauty. I might even say that this is my least favorite one from her, which might be surprising to a lot of people, but it is still stunning, and the shades in here are beautiful. I recently panned on Supernova, which is a beautiful kind of pink to gold duochrome, and yeah, this is one that I think a lot of people have already seen, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but that is my first palette from Huda Beauty. The most recent one, which is also my favorite palette from her, is the Rose Quartz palette. This is one that I picked up. I got it about a year ago. I originally picked this one up for a friend as a birthday present, but she already had it in her collection, so I got to keep it, and I'm so happy I did. I love this palette so much. Again, it's a bit more of a cool tone palette. It has some mauve tones, a bit more kind of pink leaning this time, and not so cool toned. It also has some warm tones there on the top row, so it is a bit more versatile, and yeah, I really love this one. It has very sparkly shades, which I enjoy, and it's probably one of my best palettes in my collection. It's not my favorite out of all of them, but it's probably at least a top 5. The next palette is actually my first palette from Huda Beauty, which is the Gold Obsessions, like I mentioned. I got this one, it was a Cult Beauty exclusive. I really like this palette. I think it got a lot of mixed reviews because of the shimmer formula in here. They're quite unpredictable and very kind of, you know, they vary from shade to shade. But I still like this palette. I love the kind of mattes in here. I think they are perfect. And because of the kind of more mauve toned mattes, I feel like this is a bit more unique than other gold palettes that I have. And it's just a small one and very kind of handy to have, and I do really enjoy this palette. The last palette that I have from Huda Beauty is the Nude Light Obsessions palette. I got this at the same time as the Mercury Retrograde palette. I love this palette. Again, it has those kind of soft romantic tones that I feel like are absolutely stunning. And it's very unique in my collection because of that. I mean, I have it in other palettes too, but this is just a stunning palette. I really love this one. I think a lot of people prefer the medium and the rich version of this palette, but I instantly fell for this light version and I love it. You can see I have 2 pans in here already, and I do reach for this one every now and then. It's one that I want to reach for more, but again, I just been focused on things that I'm panning too much, and I haven't really been able to reach for this one as much as I want, but I'm going to try to make a mental note to do that again next year. I have a couple more palettes to go. The next palette is my Naked Shores and Beauty Bay palette. This one is one that looks like this. I'm not going to talk about this one too much because you might already know, but this is going to be my Panda palette for next year. So it's one that I'm going to try to pan and get out of my collection next year, because it's not my favorite. I did really enjoy it when I first got it, but I feel like I have other things that I prefer, and that's kind of part of the reason why I want to pan it. Another Beauty Bay palette that isn't my favorite is the Book of Magic palette. I wanted this palette so much, and I didn't get it at the initial release. However, I did pick it up on eBay, again, basically brand new. I think it was swatched and that was it. I do kind of regret it a little bit though, because it's just not my color story. It has a lot of blues and turquoises are kind of my least type of favorite blue. It also has a lot of deep tones, which again isn't my favorite. I do really love the purples here though. They are stunning, as well as the neutral tones. So there is parts of this palette that I do still enjoy, but yeah, I do kind of regret picking this one up, and it's one that I want to get more use out of and potentially declutter next year. The next 2 palettes I have from Beauty Bay though, I really do enjoy. The first one is the Wilderness palette, which is one that I did pick up. Both of the palettes that are next I did pick up on launch. Or not on launch, but like when they were still available on Beauty Bay. This is a palette I fell in love with because it was my product level up level 5 palette. So that's why I have so many pans in here. I think this is a beautiful color story. I think it's very versatile. It's basically like a rainbow palette, but it's like slightly more muted, and I really like it. I think it's super well made. The shimmers in here are stunning, very sparkly, glittery, and the kind of shimmer formula that I really like from Beauty Bay. But yeah, that is the next one, and I think a lot of people have this palette, and everyone who does love it. It's unfortunate that it is discontinued though. That's kind of the downside with Beauty Bay, that they release a lot of beautiful palettes, but they also do discontinue them relatively fast. So this one unfortunately is no longer available. Then the last one from Beauty Bay might actually be my favorite, and that is the Love Nose palette. Again, it has those kind of more romantic tones in it, like the pink, the purples, very muted. I think a lot of people wouldn't like this because it goes very light, but that is kind of what I like. It has a few deeper tones, but not super rich. But again, it's kind of what I go for every single day, and I think this is good kind of everyday palette for me, because I have like those pinky tones if I want. I can go more purpley if I want. It does also have a few neutral tones if I want to stick in that kind of route, and I can deepen it up if I want. So it's one that I haven't reached for so much this year, because again, I've been panning a lot of shades, but I have tried to reach for it more in the last couple of months, and it's definitely one that I'm going to continue reaching for next year. So we have a few more kind of miscellaneous brands left. The first one is BH Cosmetic, which I have 1 palette from, which is the Blueberry Muffin palette. This is one that was on the shopping block, but I do think this is a unique enough palette in my collection, and the quality is really nice. It's definitely up there, and I think the color story as well is beautiful. It's hard to capture though on camera because of the reflective background, but it is a beautiful palette, and I'm really happy to have it in my collection. It's just one that I wouldn't really reach for every single day, but I do think it has its place in my collection. Another palette that is unfortunately discontinued but I absolutely love is the Club Nebula palette from Kaleidos in collaboration with Angelica Nyqvist. This is what this one looks like on the inside. I think you all have seen it before. I think this one is a super well made palette. I think she did such a good job with this palette. I did not pick up her collaboration with Oden's Eye. Kind of regret it a little bit, but I'm happy to have this one in my collection at least. It has a lot of deep tones in here, which again I said isn't my favorite. However, these stay a bit more colorful, like they don't go so muddy, which I do enjoy, and the shimmers are absolutely stunning. They're very sparkly, very kind of dimensional, and it's one again that I want to reach for more. It's more of a wintry kind of palette to me, so I think I'm going to try to reach for this one a couple more times in the upcoming months. Speaking of Oden's Eye, I have two palettes to share from Oden's Eye. The first one is the Elva palette. This one is another kind of mauve tone palette, but this one is definitely more kind of warm tone, mauve toned. It also has those pops of yellows here on the side, and I think this palette is stunning. It's one that I've wanted for a long time, and I picked up Black Friday last year, so I've had this for about a year now as well. It's really stunning. The only thing I would say is some of the shimmers in here are very similar. Like these two here are very, like, extremely similar. They're also quite similar to this one, although this one is a slightly different tone. But yeah, I do think this palette is really nice, and I'm happy to have it in my collection. It's definitely unique. I don't have too many kind of mauve tone palettes, although I did pick up a few more this past year, but this one is definitely unique out of those because again it is slightly more warm tone leaning. The next Oden's Eye palette I have is the Red Dragon palette, which is another collaboration palette. This one was in collaboration with Judy. I think this palette is, I always say, kind of my perfect color story because it's neutral. It has a pop, like pops some green. It has some special shades in it, and I do really like this palette. But I just for some reason don't reach for it. It's just one that don't draw me in, but I think I need to maybe do like a 1 week more palette with this palette, and if I do that I might fall in love with it more and reach for it more and kind of find looks that I like with it. So I need to make this palette that is very neglected in my collection, but it's one that I do want to reach for more, so maybe that will be like something I can roll into different projects next year to try to either do like No Pan Left Behind or a certain amount of uses on to fall in love with this palette more. So next palette is one that I have used quite a bit recently, and that is because it is my perfect level up palette at the moment. That is Tiny Marvels palette from Sydney Grace. This palette is stunning. It looks like this currently. Again, I'm currently working on it. It might be different from when you see this video because again this video is pre-filmed, but I love this color story. It's so stunning. The quality is incredible. I mean, most of these shades I've already reached for 3+ times and you can't even tell. The only shades that really have a dip in them are like these 3 shimmers, which are the ones that I have reached for the most. But yeah, I'm not going to talk about this one too much because I have spoken about it a lot in my Perfect Level Up, and you all know that I do love this palette. Next up though, we have a Sydney Grace palette that I don't love as much, and that is the Sweet Indulgence palette. This is one that I got free with purchase. I still count this kind of as a purchase though because I got to pick which days to shop on to get like different gifts, and this is one that I picked up on one of the days. I think the individual colors in here are stunning. There might be like, I feel like these 2 shades here aren't my favorite, but apart from that every single shade in here I think is stunning. However, I don't reach for this palette. I have reached for one shade, which is Gumdrop, because it was in a project. I reached for that one once, and apart from that I haven't reached for this palette at all. So what I have decided to do is declutter this palette, but I'm going to depot the shades into my singles collection. They are already magnetic, so I'm going to depot these, swatch them on, compare them to other shades in my collection, and possibly put most of these in my singles collection apart from maybe these 2. But yeah, the palette itself will be decluttered. We have 2 more Sydney Grace palettes to go, and the next one is the California Coast palette. Both of these 2 palettes were giftable purchases on the last Christmas and July sale. I like this one. Again, it's more of a cool tone palette. It has like some more mauve tones, but again the tone of the mauves in here are a bit more unique. I feel like these are slightly, it's definitely cool toned, but it's not so pink leaning. It's more kind of sandy toned leaning. I guess it's somewhat in the same veins as the Gum Coconuts palette, but I love this palette. I have reached for most of the shades in here apart from I think these 3 shimmers at the bottom, and yeah, I like this palette a lot. I want to reach for it more, but again I just haven't had a chance to play around with it too much, but so far, so this one is definitely one I'm going to try to reach for more next year. So the last Sydney Grace palette and the last palette on my spreadsheet at the moment is the Mountain Trail palette. This one is one, again, I got as a free gift with purchase, and I love this color story. I think this one is such a beautiful palette. Again, this is kind of like my neutral kind of tones, like my green neutrals. I love those. Obviously, this one is warmer tone than, for example, the Child palette, which I mentioned earlier. But yeah, I love this palette. I have reached for it quite a few times, creating more kind of, again, neutral looks leaning green, and I think it's stunning. I'm so happy I was able to get this as a gift with purchase, because I would have picked this one up in a heartbeat, even full price, but again, I got this as a free gift, which yeah, I can't be happier about, and it's again one that I'm going to continue reaching for. I have reached for this one more than the California Coastal, but I do want to continue reaching for this palette because I love it a lot. So that brings me to the last two palettes, which are not yet in my spreadsheet because I recently got them. The first one is a gift, or like a declutter, I guess, from my friend Martina. This is the Luna Beauty Eternal Eclipse palette. I haven't yet played with this one, but it's a stunning palette. Again, it's more cool toned, and I feel like this one is very unique to my collection because, again, I don't have too many cool tone palettes, which is why I got it from her when she was decluttering it, because she's definitely more into cool tones than I am, so she has more tones like this in her collection. But I'm excited to play around with this formula. I have swatched out the mattes and they seem really silky, and I can't wait to play around with it and try the Luna Beauty formula because again, because it's been on my list to try for a long time, and I finally have a palette of theirs in my collection. It might not have been the palette that I picked up if I was going to pick up one palette from them. I think the Nude Prism is the one that I have been on my mind the most, but I feel like maybe that's a good thing because that means this one is again more unique to my collection, and hopefully then I can get some more use out of it. Then the last palette that I have is one that I did pick up myself during Black Friday, and that is the Kaleidos Sashimi City palette. This is the Futurism 7. This one is again, is my newest palette in my collection. It looks like this. I think this color story is stunning. I think this is a beautiful kind of palette to maybe travel with, to create really easy, effortless looks with. And I think the shimmers in here, there's two shimmers and they are both stunning. I swatched them out. I haven't played around with this again on my eyes yet, but I swatched out the shimmers and they are so dimensional, so sparkly, and I love them. The only kind of gripe with this palette that I have is that the two browns on the very ends are a bit too similar in my opinion, but I still feel like I'm gonna get a lot of use out of this palette, and I'm really happy to have it in my collection. So those were all the palettes that I have. I just want to sum up quickly because I have 5 palettes that I want to declutter, and they are right here. So again, we have the Sweet Indulgence palette from Sydney Grace, we have the Flutter By palette from Colourpop, the Prism palette from Anastasia, and then lastly my 2 Juvia's Place palettes, the Tribe, as well as the Magic Mini palette. So those 5 will be leaving my collection after this video. I will depot maybe a handful of shades into my singles if they are unique enough. But that is basically my eyeshadow palette collection as of now. So those, you guys, were all of the palettes in my collection. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And otherwise, I will catch you in my next one. Bye guys.